The recollection of forms of spirit in Finnegan's Wake. Hegel meets Joyce. Had Joyce read Hegel, or was he familiar with his ideas? Hegel and his ideas are alluded to on a few occasions in the Wake. In chapter 5, for instance, the chapter that focuses on the mysterious letter from Boston, that had been mentioned in the first chapter and is frequently referred to throughout the text. Apparently a letter that Anna Livia Plurabel dictated to Shem, her son, Shem the penman, who was perhaps Joyce himself. In mock seriousness, various theories and approaches to the interpretation of the letter are presented. Perhaps this stands for an analogy of the Wake itself. Included is an investigation into the letter's authorship. Who actually wrote it? Well, Hegel, apparently. There were some Armenian words in there: Baron Luzador, Mr. Lightgiver, and Hall Hagel, Cargill, meaning to play. And there was certainly a playfulness concerning how scholars might try to interpret the Wake. In interpreting the letter, there was a variety of reading strategies and mock seriousness, various theories and approaches to interpreting it, including textual, historical, Freudian analyses, a discussion of the intricacy and beauty of the letter, its arrangement of words, the deciphering of the letter's meaning, about reading or understanding the letter. Like the Wake, it is a work, and I quote from the Wake here, a work meant to be keen again and again and again, to make sound sense and sense sound kin again. The narrator of much of the chapter is a pedantic and pompous professor explaining a difficulty interpreting the letter because its context was not only temporally indeterminate, but also part of the letter, and every person, place, and thing always connected with the letter was moving and changing every part of the time. And these were and included and continued more or less misunderstanding minds of the anti-collaborators. Given the complexity of the issues, the contextualizing professor warns against concentrating solely on the literal sense or even the psychological content of any document to the sore neglect of the enveloping facts themselves. And the Wake is a text that incorporates and demands its own commentary, thereby being a letter to the critic as well as to the ordinary reader. In the next chapter, chapter 6, Hegel appears again, Dr. Gedanke of Stoutgirth. Stuttgart, the capital of Baden-Württemberg, southwestern Germany. Hegel was born and educated there. Weil thou bist one Zoom of a war. Weil du bist ein Sohn der Welt, which is German, because you are a son of the world. One Zoom of a war, son of a whore. And also, there's also a reference to a quote from Hitler in there, unfortunately, but of course this was well before the Second World War. Zoom is Dutch, seam, hem, fringe, and zoon is Dutch for sun. In a letter to his adjutants, Hitler said, there is but one moment when the goddess of fortune wafts by, and if you don't grab her then by the hem, you won't get a second chance. Right, Book 2, Chapter 4 of the Wake, reference to Hegel's thoughts on space and time. Spirits of time, spirits of wine. Hegel wrote in the philosophy of history, history in general is therefore the development of spirit in time, as nature is the development of the idea in space. Hegel is also mentioned in Book 3, Chapter 1, in the retelling of Aesop's The Ant and the Grasshopper, or The Ant and the Grasshopper. Hegel's tomes. Hailstone. Hegel is German for hail. Hegel was a voluminous writer, although he actually published 2 books in his lifetime, which was The Phenomenology of Spirit and The Science of Logic. As for the influence of Hegelian ideas on the wake, I think a very good case can be made for it living up well to Hegelian standards that art should aspire to. In an early essay entitled Ecce Homo on Drama and Life, Joyce writes about artworks that he greatly esteems, including Mikhail Munkach's painting Ecce Homo. In Joyce's use, the term drama denotes a standard of quality that all works of art should aspire to, and he writes that in art-loving and art-producing society, the drama would naturally take up its position at the head of all artistic institutions. But there is no material evidence to support the idea that Joyce had actually read Hegel's Aesthetics. However, Joyce and Hegel's respective definitions of drama are certainly very similar. Hegel asserted that the dramatic work has a purely poetic aspect which can be envisaged independently from its scenic representation, and Joyce described drama as an independent thing, conditioned but not controlled by its scene. Joyce wrote that by drama I understand the interplay of passions. Drama is strife, evolution, movement. It exists as an independent thing, controlled, conditioned but not controlled by its scene. Hegel's aesthetic theory in a nutshell is that beauty has certain formal qualities, the unity or harmony of different elements in which these elements are not just arranged in a regular symmetrical pattern, but are unified organically. And it is not just a matter of form, but also a matter of content. Which makes sense to me, but it is actually one of Hegel's most controversial ideas, which sets him at odds with those of modern artists and art theorists, who insist that art can embrace any content they like, and indeed can dispense with content altogether. This content that Hegel claims is central and indispensable genuine art is the freedom and richness of spirit. That content is the idea or absolute reason, a self-knowing spirit, and since the idea is pictured in religion as God, the content of truly beautiful art is in one respect the divine, and the idea of God comes to consciousness of itself only in and through finite human beings. The content must be the divine in human form or the divine within humanity itself, as well as purely human freedom. This certainly applies to a work such as The Wake, as opposed to, say, Samuel Beckett, who said in a 1956 New York Times interview, when he contrasted his approach with that of Joyce, he's tending towards omniscience and omnipotence as an artist. I'm working with impotence, ignorance. And Hegel's idealistic philosophy, to be complete, has to deduce every detail in the universe, so can only ever be complete in principle. For infinite knowledge, omniscience would be required to complete it. So Hegel is tending towards omniscience and omnipotence. And furthermore, on the matter of content, Beckett also said in an interview, I realized that Joyce had gone as far as one could in the direction of knowing more, in control of one's material. He was always adding to it. You only have to look at his proofs to see that. I realized that in my own way was impoverishment, in lack of knowledge and in taking away, subtracting, rather than adding. It is well known that Joyce modelled The Wake on the philosophy of history of Giambattista Vico. while Hegel is not often mentioned in connection with the wake. But during the earliest stages of drafting the novel, his influences on the evolving structure of the book was arguably as great as that of Vico. Although Hegel and Vico both discerned a cyclical pattern in human history, their philosophies of history are very different. Vico's is like a wheel that turns in place, traversing the same ground over and over again, whereas Hegel's is like a spiral staircase which ascends as it turns. For Vico, history repeats the same pattern, while Hegel believed that each revolution brought humanity closer to the realization of the ideal or absolute. In Ulysses, Mr. Deasy's characterization of human history in the Nestor episode is essentially Hegelian. He said, all history moves towards one great goal, the manifestation of God. But Joyce was always suspicious of the idea of progress in history and never lost what Richard Ellman called his nostalgia for the Aristotelian Middle Ages. In 1911, in an essay on the Renaissance, Joyce wrote, the much trumpeted progress of this century consists for the most part of a tangle of machines whose aim is simply to gather fast and furiously the scattered elements of profit and knowledge and to redistribute them to each member of the community who can afford a small fee. End quote. So ultimately, the only lasting impression Hegel made on Finnegan's Wake lies in its fourfold structure, whereby in Vico's philosophy of history, there are three phases through which civilization passes in each cycle, whereas Hegel's philosophy of history discerns four. The first stage of the world history being that of the Oriental world, then the Greek world, the Roman world, and then that of the medieval Germanic world. Joyce, in adapting Vico, may be promoting Vico's transitional ricorso, or return between successive cycles, into a fourth age on the same level as the other three, or perhaps he merely Hegelianized Vico's cycle. As you can see, Hegel is mentioned in an early letter that Joyce wrote to his patron Harriet Weaver about a meeting which actually took place in the last chapter of the book, which is one of the first that Joyce wrote, a meeting between St. Patrick, patron saint of Ireland, and Bishop Berkeley, Irish philosopher, subjective idealist philosopher actually. It's quite possible Joyce never actually read any of Hegel's writings and was only familiar with the barest bones of his philosophy, namely the cyclical aspect of history which he picked up at second hand. None of Hegel's works appear in the library of books Joyce left in Trieste when he moved to Paris, nor do any Hegelian texts feature in his Paris library. He did have a complete set of the 11th edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica in Paris, which he consulted extensively while writing The Wake. But the article on Hegel runs to over 7 pages, and there is very little on Hegel's philosophy of history, and nothing that is particularly relevant to The Wake. But maybe Joyce learnt of Hegel from a fellow student during his days at University College Dublin, where Thomas Kettle was the butt of one of Joyce's occasional limericks, in which he is described as an Hegelian. A holy Hegelian kettle has faith which we cannot unsettle. If no one abused it, he might have reduced it, but now he is quite on his mettle. And so, what my thesis is actually about. I can't actually bring Hegel in straight away because the very first word in Finnegan's Wake is reveron, which could be from the French reveron, meaning let us dream, but I take it as erinnern, German, to recollect. Erinnern is crucial to Hegel's system, and what is being recollected? Well, he says so in the last section of the Phenomenology of Spirit. Geister is the word. Spiritual forms as it was translated in an old translation. One final thing before that we need to understand before we go into the details is Hegel's thought on necessity. A scientific system, which means, well, the Wissenschaft, any sort of systematic inquiry. The phenomenology, like the phenomenology, is about the development of the spirit. It's to understand why all the different stages of this development are necessary. It's not a description of something static but dynamic and organic, and we transform that which seems contingent into something we understand as necessary. The task of phenomenology is to transform what seems merely coincidental into something of which we recognize its necessity. Hegel calls this the rational element and the rhythm of the organic whole. For instance, like falling in love, two people happening to meet is grounded in contingency, but upon falling in love, they perceive their entire past as leading to this moment. They were waiting all their life for the other person. Something contingent is transformed into something that now totally makes sense, like a logical conclusion of what happened before leading up to this event. The necessity of the progression, the interrelation of understanding an event in the context of a dynamic life of the whole process. Notwendigkeit is the word for necessity. Note, need, and wendig, flexible enough to react appropriately to the situation or to turn around. It's a common German word, and we can think of this as a critical need, which brings a turnaround. Notwendigkeit in the Hegelian sense is to be translated as critical. Understanding necessity is to be understood why something was critical in a given situation. The phenomenology is reconstructing the spirit of humankind so the critical significance of every critical moment in history is understood. For an individual, this is the same as understanding the critical moments of one's own individual development that necessarily contributed to the person one is right now. After you've heard this presentation, it will be a critical moment in your life, making you into the person you are. After listening to my presentation, it will change your self-building in a particular way. If you want to understand yourself after listening to this presentation, you need to understand why listening to it was a critical experience for you. This is something that was reversed by the existentialists, of course. Nietzsche in the gay science, Die Fröhliche Wissenschaft, the frolicking science. Nietzsche focuses on development and evolution. He formulates his own genealogical approach. Informed by a great suspicion, the parody begins, he said, into a gay or frolicking transformation, an ironic science, in which what seems necessity is transformed into contingency. The purely spiritual are merely disguises. Philosophy has never been about truth but about power, an unconscious disguise of physiological needs cloaked into objective, the spiritual, the ideal. Disguising unconscious elements, the desire for truth is bad taste, while we are too joyful, and so on. Now, of course, Samuel Beckett did actually say that reality for Joyce is not a perception of order or love, but a perception of coincidence. And in his own play, for instance, Act Without Words, the action takes place in a desert illuminated by a dazzling light, which probably brings to mind Heidegger's concept of Geworfenheit, thrownness, to describe an individual's existence being thrown into the world. But there's a problem with looking for coincidences. character in one of Philip K. Dick's novels has a theory, which he bases upon a quotation from The Wake, which mentions talk tapes, which occurs in the Anna Livia episode where the two washerwomen on the River Liffey. I mean, talk tapes, whatever that word means, it's presumably there to evoke talking laundry, but it does not mean tape recorders, which hadn't been invented yet. So, just to give an example of what I'm not doing in my thesis, Lem is having his fun here. The Perfect Vacuum contains a series of reviews of non-existent books, one by Patrick Hanahan, a novel that is Gilgamesh. It's a novel that's supposed to do for the Gilgamesh legend what Ulysses did for the Homer's Odyssey. And as you can see, that is just, Lem having his fun at the expense of Joyce scholars rather than Joyce himself. This is not my approach to interpreting the Wake, what John Lehman described the Wake as a wanton surrender to the crossword puzzle part of the mind, which is not how I see it. Much as I like crosswords, if that's all it was, I wouldn't be spending so much time trying to unravel its mysteries. So I'll end with an example of how Hegelian analysis of the Wake works in practice. Taking the form of spirit, the last form of spirit, in fact, absolute knowing, and reading the ending of the Wake in the light of it. So, the phenomenology of spirit culminates in absolute knowing, in contrast to reason, spirit, and religion. It's another story, of course, whether we will ever actually reach absolute knowing. Religion is the content of the absolute. Moral action is its form. Time is necessary for the unity of the two, because time is necessary for the unfolding of the notion. In religion, the stance toward the absolute is one of faith. Why is there evil in the world if a good God exists, and so on? Kierkegaard, a famous critic of Hegel, thought that a religion is only a religion if we can't understand it. We accept its absurdity and can't communicate it to anyone else. Kierkegaard was wanting to say that with the absolute from the standpoint of faith. Hegel wants to from the standpoint of knowledge. Absolute knowledge is the concrete self-knowledge that allows the world in its entirety to appear as something rational, even to the point of death itself can be understood as rational in a necessary part of life, rather than as some frightening thing that is separate from it or antithetical to it. Absolute knowing allows for the full reconciliation of humanity and world finally to be achieved. It can do what religion can't do. Life itself makes sense when grasped as a work of notion, but that only makes sense when it is grasped as our work, the work of our self-consciousness. Essence and existence are no longer out of accord with one another, for if you have that rationalization of the world itself, essence and existence fully reconciled rather than our being thrown into circumstances we did not expect or understand and are somehow expected to cope on a moment-to-moment basis, which is the classic formula of existentialism. It does make sense we will all eventually die, of course, but we now even accept that without anxiety or alienation. It is one of the ironies of philosophy that pretty much all of the great existentialist philosophy was written after Hegel had made a bold pronouncement as a response against exactly this claim, that very thrownness into existence that I mentioned earlier in connection with Beckett's play and Heidegger, thrownness. So, action expresses a set of phases. Time plus knowledge is a form of self, but not an infinity, a never-ending series of vanishing moments. Eternity is not a static beyond lying outside of time. Time is a cycle. Spirit is presented to itself in time because it is not yet complete. So the end presupposes the beginning, And if we go to the beginning and read it again, it all makes better sense. So, to the last chapter of the Wake. Recall that the content of absolute knowledge is religion and moral action gradually waking up on a Sunday morning, but in the place of Christian harmony or of a mind at peace there is an anxious deliberation of a guilty conscience gambling from image to image in nervous disjointedness as echoes resound of many prevalent themes from elsewhere in the Wake. Recollection. In this chapter, there was a great deal of guilt to begin with. The notion of guilt endeavours to get hold of quite a potent notion of something beyond, of something being mine. This indeed is modernity's achievement, the notion that one sees oneself as a kind of self whose individual rights determine what is ultimately right or wrong. Indeed, it is a fundamental principle of a life together with others. A guilty conscience depends upon communal ethics, but what of a conscience that takes on the whole of history, the entirety of cultures, in particular where original sin supposedly resides, blighting every spirit? Intentional agency together with a self-conscious understanding of it that is both theoretical and practical, of the form of a recollective reconciliation of traditional and modern structures, informed by a particular understanding of them. Such ethical, practical understanding of intentional agency is heroic for Hegel, for through it agents take responsibility for their deeds under all the descriptions that are accurate of those deeds. And this is what Anna Livia does. Anna exonerates Humphrey Chimpton Earwicker from his guilt while literally and metaphorically trying to wake him up. In her mind's eye they are out walking, not such big strides, huddy-fuddy, fuddy-duddy. Holy Father, she is bringing him to a place they know well by yonder house. They are alone and have lots of time on their hands, time before the events of the past are reenacted. Anna Livia is exquisitely pleased about the loveliest tree she has is gradually disintegrates. Little by little her fiancé's moving dress is coming apart. One leaf glides on a wave that goes to mingle as foam with eternal waves here. She murmurs, I only hope hold the heavens see us. Into the deeps she carries one last leaf with her to remind her of life, and all things are reflected in the opposites. Contradictions are resolved. Anna Livia never disavows original sin. And again the action expresses a set of phases, but this is not a series of vanishing moments, for time is a cycle. And the end presupposes the beginning. So, back to the beginning. My head is obscuring it actually there. You bet your boughtem blarney, that says. You bet your boughtem blarney. You go back to the beginning, read it again, and it all makes better sense.